Good morning. My talk is called Now What? The title wasn't on the program, and I actually really didn't know what I was going to talk about. It's getting more and more challenging for me to come up with something really exciting. But actually, I decided I was going to do a talk that's kind of a part 2 of the talk I gave at ClojureScript in Finland in September. That talk was called The Next 5 Years of ClojureScript. If you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out. Raise your hand if you use ClojureScript at all. Okay, that's really awesome. It's a lot of you. It's really great, very exciting. ClojureScript is now 5.5 years old. It's been a while, which means that there's actually a lot of stories that people aren't familiar with, lots of technical decisions and things that happened that people missed along the way. 5.5 years is a long time, lots of interesting contributions. And that's a really great story. But that's not what I want to focus on today. When I gave that talk, I sort of ended it sort of talking about the community side of things. Specifically, whereas that talk was about the next 5 years of ClojureScript as far as its continued technical progression, I kind of want to talk about the next 5 years of ClojureScript sort of from the perspective of how do we grow the community and how do we get people interested in this pretty awesome technology that we've built. So again, we've come an incredibly long way. When I gave the talk at ClojureScript, I mean, very few people remember ClojureScript from the early days. Just a handful of people. I mean, there were 2 years without source maps. Figwheel appeared much later, and a lot of the awesome tooling and integrations that we have with the wider JavaScript ecosystem. Those are all recent developments, right? It's all new stuff. And now I think the story is really compelling for the average developer. Previously, ClojureScript was cool, but it definitely felt a bit like alpha geek technology. So what's nice about ClojureScript, I just want to start off. I mean, this part is kind of going to be a kind of repeat of things that have been said numerous times. But yet they form the foundations of ClojureScript. And when we talk about ClojureScript, I do think that we should emphasize these things because these are the essence of the technology and why we like it. I'm going to talk a little bit later about things that I think are easier to get people to try it, right? That's something that I think we need to think a bit more about. How do we get people to try the thing? But at the same time, once they try it, they'll see that, wow, you've made a lot of very sound technology decisions in this really cool piece of technology that makes me want to stay, right? So there's 2 problems, getting people to stay and getting people to try it. But I think the getting people to stay part has been solved in a really awesome way. At the foundation of ClojureScript, if you use Clojure or ClojureScript, is persistent data structures. This is something that even when I started doing Clojure as a hobby, I think in 2008, you sort of like, really, immutable data structures, can you really design interesting programs without typical amounts of state? And it turns out, wow, you really can write almost any program that you used to write, and you can really narrow down the places where you have to think about state transitions. And you never want to go back, right? Once you have this, this is the way you want to program. When Clojure came out in 2007, this is a long time ago, right? That's almost 10 years ago. I was like, once you got into it, you're like, okay, persistent data structures are the future. 10 years from now, all programming languages will come out with persistent data structures. And the truth is that Clojure is still, as far as I can tell, it's almost a decade ahead, right? It's still not the case that people are designing programming languages with immutable data structures at the foundation. In this regard, I think Clojure is far more sound than most of the alternatives, which is cool. So this is kind of an interesting thing. There are these weird side effects, things that you could not predict. So Rich Hickey designs a language for the JVM, and it's about concurrency and writing these really awesome, expressive, highly concurrent programs. And when ClojureScript came out, people were scratching their heads and were like, well, why do we need persistent data structures on a single-threaded virtual machine? That doesn't make any sense. And it's because we don't know what it means yet. And I think it's become blindingly obvious now to many people, and people far beyond the Clojure and ClojureScript community, that immutable data structures have really awesome implications for single-threaded applications, specifically for UI work. And it's because Clojure and ClojureScript are founded on immutable data structures as a principle, and to a large degree we already had a culture of let's put our state in a very small number of places, since that's the pattern that Clojure guides you toward, that things like Figwheel are possible. So Figwheel, I'm sure, raise your hand if you use Figwheel. Yeah. Basically, almost anybody that uses ClojureScript uses Figwheel. But this is a real cool thing, a synergy, right? You started with persistent data structures and you think, okay, it's easier to reason about my program, but you don't realize that it's that discipline around functional programming and persistent data structures that make Figwheel works. It makes it work really, 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 really great. There is nothing comparable to this in the JavaScript world. There are hot code reloading patterns, but they never work as well as ClojureScript because we are starting from the right place philosophically for live coding to really, really work with very few issues. This is something that once you have, again, you never want to go back. You know, persistent data structures, live coding, you're like, no, I'm not going to go back to the old way. Another thing that's sort of at the foundation that I think we should talk about more is Google Clojure, a very solid choice. This was definitely yet another head scratcher in the early days for people in ClojureScript's existence, but it turns out to be a really, really great idea. If you want to have large libraries, if you want to have a large standard library, if you're going to have lots of interesting dependencies, whether that's a layer over React, or whether that's going to be a date-time library, or whether that's going to be core async, or what have you, you have confidence that Google Clojure will do the right thing with respect to dead code elimination. It also has features that it's had for at least 5 years. Things like code splitting. And the code splitting is function level code splitting. It can move functions to the correct module. And this is something that it's never going to happen for JavaScript. People have said, I've listened to people say about Webpack and all these other build tools, we're going to get dead code elimination. We're going to get automatic code splitting. And it's never going to happen because there's a culture of writing code which is very hard to statically analyze. And that's not true for ClojureScript because we generate that boring JavaScript for you that Google Clojure has a very easy time manipulating to do these kinds of optimizations. So this is huge. And so we're watching sort of the JavaScript community struggle to achieve this, and we've had this for 5.5 years. Then you have things like React. Like when I gave a talk on React, I don't know, it's been 3 years since I did my, 3 years? Maybe 3 years? Maybe 2.5 years or so since I did my first post where I said, I think React is going to be a big thing. I don't know, it was like a month ago, the React team said, React now has 55,000 GitHub stars. It's far, exceeded, I think, pretty much everything, with maybe the exception of Angular, but I think it may have surpassed Angular. I think it's, you can say without qualification that React is a massive success, and things like React Native are just picking up more and more steam. So React is delivering on the promise of being a way to get to lots of targets, whether those are web targets, desktop targets, or mobile targets. And that's great. We can just ride that wave. It worked out more or less how I expected it to. React, I think, is, again, without qualification, just light years beyond what people were doing prior to that. But the cool thing is that the ClojureScript community was prepared. While a lot of the people in the JavaScript community were like, well, I don't know about this thing with XML literals, ClojureScript people were like, yes, let's go. We're ready for this, because finally you have a UI solution which is good for immutable data structures, right? It's just a perfect pairing. We want functional programming, we want to do UI work, but we kind of want to do functional UI programming, and React gave us the perfect story for us to be able to do that. And now you have, an explosion of awesome, amazing bindings to React, whether that's reagent, rum, of course you have Ohm, you have quiescent, you have a bunch. So there's a bunch of different things you can use, but everybody agrees that React is a very, very, very good fit for ClojureScript. So there's a sense here that I think ClojureScript is very well positioned. In many ways, we're ahead of the industry. We know what works, and we're sort of ahead of the curve. And I think we should be aware of that, and when we communicate the benefits of ClojureScript, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. There are some new things, and you've heard me talk about these things, and they're starting to pick up steam. I mean, there's a time when something gets released, and there's a time when people decide, hey, we're going to do that thing. Relay and GraphQL, Falcor, and Datomic. I think these have really huge positive implications for the way that we think about UI applications, specifically when there's a very serious client-server component. And you're seeing this happen. GitHub, I think a couple months ago, maybe it was a month ago, they announced that their entire API uses GraphQL. So if you haven't looked at these technologies, I highly recommend spending some time looking at them. I think it's always really important that for Clojure and ClojureScript programmers that we're not always looking at our own stuff. There's lots of interesting ideas outside of our circle, and we should assess them and figure out which parts either we can just use as they exist, for example, React, or maybe things like GraphQL. Maybe perhaps there is a very great way to leverage GraphQL, but also maybe there's an opportunity here to show, okay, we can take that idea and we can do it better. Much in the same way that, a lot of the typical things that you see in React programs, a lot of the sort of ClojureScript bindings over React try to make the scope of what React needs to do quite a bit simpler than what it does out of the box. Okay, and then I think finally, as far as the sound sort of technology foundation, because of things like React and React Native, and the fact that ClojureScript targets, JavaScript runtimes going back to 2001, right? We generate JavaScript code that was valid in 2001. So, JavaScript that's valid for 15 years, and it's going to be valid, moving forward because they're not going to change JavaScript because they can't break the internet. So we have a very good mobile story. So we're delivering on the promise that Rich Hickey sort of stated at the beginning, which is that this is going to be the mobile story, places where the JVM can't run. At Clojure Tray, it was also clear that this was the case. I saw 2 presentations, I think, on React Native. People are building and shipping stuff with React Native and ClojureScript, and they really, really like it. And that experience is only going to get better. Okay, so this is stuff that you probably already know, that you've probably already heard. And I think, never sort of forget the principles when you want to talk about why ClojureScript is compelling. This is the sort of sound technical foundation that allows us to achieve all the other things. But does picking good, sound technical foundations actually lead to success? To people actually adopting your technology? And the truth is I'm not sure that that's true. As a programmer who's been doing this actively for about a decade, you see lots of interesting technology that seems better designed, that seems better thought out, and for whatever reason, it doesn't succeed. And there are lots of reasons for this, and it's a complicated thing, and there's no simple answer. So while these sound technical foundations have definitely contributed to a degree of Clojure and ClojureScript success, I think there is more to do, and actually that work is not purely of the sort of technological variety. I do think that marketing your technology is really, really important. This is why you have communities and user groups and meetups and all this stuff. Like spreading the word is really, really important, because the truth is the lifespan of a typical programming language project is a quick death. Right? This is a slide from Simon Peyton Jones' talk on the history of Haskell, where he's really talking about he's stunned that Haskell was successful at all, right? In academia, people make these little toy research programming languages, and they're going to die once they release the paper. Nobody's going to use that thing. It was a toy. Some of these languages make it a little bit further, and maybe you get 1 user, and now you die the slow, long death until, eventually you get tired of supporting 1 or 2 users. That is the typical roadmap for programming language initiatives. So ClojureScript and Clojure, similar to Haskell, for various reasons, because it is a very strong piece of technology, did get some traction in the industrial world. And Clojure and ClojureScript obviously have. There are now quite a few Clojure and ClojureScript conferences, and I'm sure that many of you are using it for work, and that's great. But there is a question of how do we continue to make this a viable thing, a sustainable thing, so that all of us get to write Clojure and ClojureScript as long as we're happy with it. This is something that you want to do. You want to think, how do we keep growing the thing? So I want to talk a bit about that. So this is an image that I took from, there's a variety of posts these days about JavaScript fatigue, and then there's all these posts about fatigue of JavaScript fatigue because people think maybe this is not a real thing. I was a professional JavaScript developer for 8 years, right? I did that for about 8 years. And I think JavaScript fatigue is real, right? I started back with jQuery, and I actually did, I used something back in the day called MooTools. And actually it turns out that all the React people were actually originally MooTools developers. In many ways, React is revenge of MooTools. But anyways, even if you haven't heard of that, this was always the case in JavaScript. You have so many options, and you're always navigating this sort of minefield of, am I making the right decision? And it really seems to me these days that it's accelerating to the point where you really have a crisis of choice. And not only that, there's also a culture, I think, of I would say, small libraries to a fault. And the problem here is that small libraries, they sound good, and of course there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the idea of small libraries. But the point is that, you know, we use very traditional version control, we use very typical notions of versioning, and when you really sort of tie all these very small things together, the interactions between these things, it's very, 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 very complicated. And you see lots of stories in the JavaScript world of people getting bogged down between all these interacting parts. In the Clojure world, it's not like we can completely escape this, right? We also have to deal with dependency management and version control. We have to deal with some of these problems. But at the same time, I think we are more our sort of spidey sense goes off, like this is probably going to introduce more complexity in the build. Maybe this is not a good idea. I think we have a slightly more refined notion of how do we build something that's simpler. So we're trying to market this thing, the idea of something that, is like the thing that other people want to do, but we're just going to reduce the number of options, right? In our programming model, we have less state. We like pure functions. We want to remove, and by removing, it allows us to be more productive or more expressive. And I think this is huge. This is one of the sort of golden principles of the Clojure or ClojureScript programmer. But this is actually kind of a hard thing to sell. Because I think if you sit down with ClojureScript or Clojure and you use it for like 6 months, and you're probably like, you're frothing at the mouth, and like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever used, everybody should use it. And you're like, this is UFO technology, and you really, truly believe this. And the problem is that maybe you think that, but that's not what anybody else sees, right? That like, this is an image you have in your own mind, a belief that you hold, and other people look at it and are like, that's Lisp, that's from '57. Why are you still doing that, right? So we really have to think that this is something we have to actively consider, the outside perspective. I mean, once you're inside, of course it seems great, but you should always be sort of sympathetic and empathetic to the people who are peering in, who might be curious, that just don't have the information that you have. And I think a lot of this is just a framing, kind of a framing problem, and sort of, again, like sort of empathizing with the person that's new to it problem. Whoops. So somebody who's really good, I think, was very good at this is, of course, Rich Hickey. His talks are great. There are like one of these talks, one of his talks, you can watch them so many times. One of the best ones, I think, is Simple Made Easy. Simple Made Easy is particularly good because it's a talk which sort of distills the philosophy of Clojure, but really doesn't talk about Clojure very much, right? It really does, you don't see any Clojure code. This is what's so awesome. For the Clojure program, you're like, oh my God, he's talking about Clojure. But for a regular program, it's like, oh, these are really cool principles about software that I believe in. And it's a great talk. And again, when you watch this talk, you see that Clojure is sort of an artifact of a philosophy, but the philosophy is something that's quite deep. And this is, I think, a good way. I mean, in many ways, you often have to prepare your audience. You say Clojure is awesome, but maybe people don't have the context to understand why that's awesome. And you say, watch this video. And they're like, did you like that video? And you say, yeah, it was amazing. Or like, that's how Clojure was designed, and that's how it continues to be designed. There's another thing that's nice about this talk, in that it also gives us a hint about how to talk about some, I would say, problematic things that you often encounter in software development, which is that sometimes in software culture, people prioritize things that are actually at odds with the thing that they want. This talk is called Simple Made Easy, and in fact, it's putting in contrast ease with simplicity. But often I think that people watch this talk and they think it's only about, oh, easy is wrong or easy is bad. And I think this is a misinterpretation. And this, of course, is my own interpretation of the talk, but I believe this is a misinterpretation of what Rich was trying to say. The problem is not that whether something is easy or not, it's whether you're prioritizing ease and destroying this sort of larger goal of simplicity. So I'm going to take a very famous quote and I'm going to change it, and that's ease tends to corrupt and absolute ease corrupts absolutely, right? If all you do is prioritize and making something easy, then it probably means that there are not that many sound foundations to the thing. There's no direct correlation here. But the point is not that easy is bad, it's that premature ease is a bad idea. Like premature optimization, it's not what you want to do. I think the goal is make something that's truly simple, that really follows these principles of simplicity, of taking something and taking something complicated and really splitting up into its bare essentials. And then once you've done that, once you've done this hard design work of making something that's simple, then you can start saying, now is the time to make this thing really approachable, to make it easy. And actually, I would say, if you look at the development of Clojure in the large, I actually think this has been happening. I mean, whether you're looking at things like Figwheel or Cursive, there is finally now a narrative that now that the core language development is slowing down, there is a collective movement around sort of lowering the barrier to entry. But I think now, more than ever, is the time where we could do a lot more. We're in a good place. A great example of this is Figwheel. So, in the early days when I was doing Clojure, like most people, you were either doing Vim or Emacs. And still to this day, Emacs is a huge influence or sort of huge tool in the Clojure user base. But I don't think it's that important. I don't think any of these things that are important, right? A lot of developers are just using the terminal, and they're just using a text editor like Atom. And the fact of the matter is something like ClojureScript works perfectly fine with this. And in fact, it's a great experience for beginners if they're using Atom with something like parinfer. They don't have to think about how to close parentheses. They don't have to learn new bindings. They just have a text editor. And because they're running Figwheel, they just save and their browser updates. This is a great experience for somebody just starting out. They don't need to include other things in this process of, I just want to pick up this new language. And I think that as a community, we should realize that we have something that works really great with hardly any other external tooling needed beyond, brew install line Figwheel new or line new Figwheel, the project, and in 30 seconds, right? In 30 seconds, as long as you have that JVM installed, you can be live coding in your browser. And you can show users, yes, you're going to get source mapping. Yes, you can set breakpoints. Doing something like this is actually quite a bit more complicated if you're going to scale it out in JavaScript. Yes, you could make a little web project that has live code reloading, but there's lots of things you have to decide on to make that work. Whereas if you use Figwheel, you start with something trivial, and the truth is that can scale to your 40,000 line ClojureScript application. I use Figwheel for work at Cognitect, and we're building large ClojureScript apps, right? It works. It's not just for newbies. It's going to be exactly the same thing you use when you become eventually an expert Clojure or ClojureScript programmer. And really the experience has come a long way. Again, looking outside of the ClojureScript community for ideas about how do we make things easier for a larger base of users, Figwheel has done a great job. They've looked at Elm. Elm is like, I think, there are lots of cool things about Elm, but one of the best things about Elm, to be honest, really the great idea is that you can have really great error messages, right? And Clojure, I think, there's not much we can do in the sense of Clojure itself. Clojure is going to do what it does, but as long as it gives us the information we need, we can provide a better experience downstream. And Figwheel is, I think, the perfect example of how much can be done, and it doesn't really require any changes to the language at all. So in Figwheel, you're often typing code, and you make an error, and you're going to get a warning in the browser. You don't even have to look at the REPL. It's going to tell you precisely on what line and what symbol you made the mistake on. So when I'm in Figwheel, I hardly, when I'm live coding a lot, I hardly have to look at the REPL when I make a mistake, because Figwheel tells me immediately where that mistake is. There's tons of possibilities here. I think we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface. I think Spec actually offers a lot of opportunities here, and I hope that in the coming, in 2017, you'll see people really show sort of how much ease you can add to understanding what's wrong with your program with the information that ClojureSpec gives you. Specifically, I think explained data is a really powerful thing that tooling can plug into. Okay, so hopefully this gives you some ideas about how to talk about the thing, about how to introduce the thing, how to frame the thing. But eventually, you're going to run aground of something that I think is, it's hard to do anything about this, which is that as software developers, you have this sort of fear of risk. If I adopt this thing, I'm going to be stuck with this thing. That's the truth. That is the truth of technology. You build something, and then you're stuck with it. And you make the wrong decision, you're stuck with it. And even if you were going to pivot at some point, you have to factor in that's going to take some amount of time to transition away from whatever choice that you made that you now decide wasn't the right one. So how do we sort of deal with the fact that people may try the thing, they may like it, and they're like, but nobody I know directly seems to use it, and it just seems risky. The funny thing is, I think, is that a lot of it's, I think we just do a horrible job communicating how old this stuff is, right? We've been doing this for 5.5 years. Very soon it's going to be 6. Very soon it's going to be 10. Right? This is not new stuff. Tons of companies are using it, right? We've long passed the point where the ClojureScript homepage has 100 companies using ClojureScript in production. The surveys that we run every year, the number just keeps going up. I remember when it was like 40% of Clojure programmers used ClojureScript, and now it's like 67%. I think that number is going to continue to climb. ClojureScript is just mature technology, and we should point out the fact that, it's under active development. There's 146 contributors now. Actually, there's more, I'm the lead developer, so I actually have to apply every single patch that comes through. There's more activity, consistent activity behind ClojureScript that's not me sitting writing code than there's ever been. There's more people that understand how the compiler works contributing than there's ever been, and I want this to grow. I mean, this should definitely be moving in a positive direction. There's a lot of stuff to do, and I want this to continue to expand. But this is something to point people at. People are like, isn't ClojureScript this new thing? And you're like, point to the Git history. It's been going on for a very, very long time. Another thing I think is funny is that, in the industry, you really people are like, oh, Clojure's weird, and ClojureScript's weird. And the thing is, ClojureScript and Clojure are built on boring technology. The most boring conservative decisions you could possibly make, right? Clojure's built on the JVM. That's boring. Everybody's on the JVM. ClojureScript targets JavaScript. That's boring. JavaScript is everywhere. But this is, in fact, our greatest strength. We make very risk-averse decisions, right? We make decisions based on, yes, we know doing something novel is risky, so let's focus on these fundamental things like functional programming or persistent data structures, but we're going to target something that is really the most mainstream thing you could possibly target, and we're going to interop as well as we can with that stuff, because no, we're not going to rewrite SQL drivers. No, we're not going to reinvent, web programming, right? We're not going to do this. We're not going to develop custom runtimes. We're just going to compile to regular old JavaScript, and we're going to provide very good interop. So that's another thing I think we need to communicate, is that Clojure and ClojureScript are actually very conservative. They're very conservative technologies. They're very much designed with risk in mind. And again, just looking at Stack Overflow, this should give us an idea as a community like how much growth potential we actually have, right? The number 1 and 2 questions on Stack Overflow are JavaScript and Java, right? Those two together dwarf everything else, right? So our potential to grow is quite large. Most people, if you throw a rock at somebody and they're in technology, they're probably writing Java, they're probably writing JavaScript. But this is a good thing. For us, that means there's a very wide audience for us to convert. If you look at the way that Rich Hickey sort of marketed Clojure in the early days, there were no Clojure programmers, right? So he had to go to Java meetups and say, hey, I'm building this thing. I'm sure you've been doing Java for, probably at that time, you've already been doing Java for 10 years, a decade, and there's probably lots of things you don't like. And here's a thing that is much more expressive, that addresses some of the problems that you might have with Java. At the same time, it doesn't really require you to give up the things that you like about Java, which is all the libraries and the robustness of the platform. And I think actually, it would be harder to make this argument for JavaScript, but I think it's becoming the case that now, as a community, we can actually actively reach out to JavaScript communities and point out that they are encountering similar problems to the problems that you were quite aware in Java in 2007 when Rich was sort of marketing Clojure. And again, this is that the JavaScript fatigue is a real thing. It's not a fake thing. JavaScript developers are now realizing that they really have a very sort of complex ecosystem and system that they're having to deal with. And I think this is a perfect time to capture some attention, and that we provide something that's, I think, markedly simpler. So I don't think it's going to stop. I think JavaScript will continue to do what it's doing. There's going to be more libraries, there's going to be more options. That's not going to change. At the same time, JavaScript as a language is going to get more complicated. The ECMAScript 2016 standard is already nearly as long as the Java 8 specification. This JavaScript is no longer a 50-page thing. There's no way that anybody knows what this language means, right? It's not possible. It's too big. It's just like Java. Anybody that says they know what it means is lying. But this is also an opportunity. JavaScript is getting more complicated. And I know that there are developers out there that don't like that. They want something simpler. And I think that we can offer them something simpler. So a really great talk that I recommend sharing. This is one of the most popular talks. It's a great talk. It was by Derek Slager. It's really worth sharing, which is the ClojureScripts for skeptics. And this is a talk for people who are like, well, it's a talk for like, well, we need to do UI work, and we're using JavaScript because we have to. Derek is a very smart developer, and I wouldn't say he's the typical like diehard JavaScript person. JavaScript is something he has to use. And he loves ClojureScript, and this is a great talk which points out why is ClojureScript practical. For somebody who absolutely must use JavaScript to accomplish some tasks, why is ClojureScript a sort of a pragmatic choice? If you haven't seen this talk, watch it. And just last night, I was at Vienna.js, or actually Vienna.js and Clojure Vienna and Vienna React. They did a combined meetup. And it was awesome. There was like 100 people there. I kicked it off and I talked about ClojureSpec. That was a lot of fun. That had a really huge response from, again, a primarily JavaScript audience. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second. But the talk after me was actually by a JavaScript developer, somebody who'd been doing JavaScript for 10 years. They'd started with Scriptaculous as a Scriptaculous developer. They were just making little nice transitions for Rails apps. And eventually they moved to jQuery and Backbone and using Grunt. And then, of course, the last thing that they did before their team decided we're done with JavaScript was they were doing Mutable.js, Lodash, Webpack, and on all the various bits they needed to sort of string together. And they really were losing time on just the complexity of all these tiny decisions that had been made in the JavaScript ecosystem that actually just sort of point everything towards incidental complexity. So his narrative is pretty interesting because he actually said, okay, this is too much. I'm spending more time fighting Webpack plugins than I'm actually writing any code. So he decided to try out Elm. And new language initiatives have this benefit of there aren't that many choices. There's probably one build tool, and even though that's just because it's a new thing, still it does mean that it narrowed a lot of the complexity. Elm also gave them a really nice, clean sort of UI programming model. He was coming from React, and if you know Redux and React or Reframe or whatever, it's all more or less the same stuff. And so for them, Elm was a huge win in terms of reducing a lot of this complexity that had sort of grown over time in the JavaScript ecosystem. But eventually they decided it wasn't right for them because Elm is really great. The great aspect of it is that it is sort of an ML, and it has a typed ML. But because it wants to really give accurate type error messages, when something goes wrong, they actually put JavaScript at arm's length. So in order to talk to JavaScript, you need to basically set up FFI. And that really, if you're going to build a project over a long period of time, and most of your libraries that you're using are not written in Elm, because that's definitely the case, right? They're not written in Elm, they're written in JavaScript. They found themselves spending a lot of time creating ports, and they really saw themselves as not getting that much benefit since they weren't going to rewrite a lot of this stuff in Elm. So that's what led them to ClojureScript. So this developer knew nothing about Clojure and knew nothing about ClojureScript. They started rewriting their application 3 months ago, knowing nothing about Clojure and ClojureScript. And immediately they started using Figwheel and the various build tools that we have, and they were blown away, right? So like Elm, you had a thing which allows them to make something with a lot less complexity, both for the build and during development, but also something that offered more, right? This was a team that had tried to do with React and hot code reloading and immutable JS, and they were struggling to ever get that to work. And then they used Figwheel, and he said, it took me 5 minutes. He did not actually have Java installed. In 5 minutes, he had a live coding experience, and they demoed their app, and it's beautiful, it works great. And their whole thing is built with Figwheel. At no point he said he had any problems, right? It's a problem-less experience. The live coding thing just works. But the point here is we're taking somebody who is not somebody who's like a believer, not somebody who's already bought in or drank the Kool-Aid. It's somebody who's coming into it cold and said, wow, you're offering something that's demonstrably better than what I was doing previously in my JavaScript only stack. So that's something to think about. These are things to think about. If there's a JavaScript user group, go to the JavaScript user group and take some of the things that I've mentioned, present it using the things that JavaScript people are familiar with. Do it with Atom, do it with Figwheel, show them something very simple, show them how fast it is, how easy it is. And then, once people are intrigued, then point out all these other benefits, these deep sort of great technology decisions that we made. I do want to spend, before I wrap up, talking a bit about spec. I think spec is huge. It's really, really huge. And so when I presented this at yesterday, I had to cut off questions because people were so interested in it. I definitely think it satisfies a specific area of risk for some people, especially if you're coming from it's very unlikely, for example, that potential users coming from Haskell. Haskell itself is a small community. It's more likely that people are coming from things like C# or TypeScript or Flow or Google Clojure, but with type annotations. That's much more likely. And they're going to ask this question, well, okay, Clojure sounds good. It sounds well-reasoned. But what do you do about the fact that it's an untyped language? And I think the types discussion is not really the important part. When people say types, they mean like, I want to have this as documentation, as specification. When I do my types, it's a way for me to communicate to other people on my team, what does this program mean? What does it do? And I think we had the beginnings of this with schema, with prismatic schema, and people wanted something like schema, though I think schema was probably not an idiomatic solution to the problem. And I think ClojureSpec really is an idiomatic one, and it's really great because it ships with the language. So it's guaranteed to be something that everybody's going to use. But I think this is huge. We have an answer to the problem of how do we communicate what our program means to other people. And I think when you show people how much spec does, the fact that you get testing, the fact that you get declarative specifications, the fact that you can generate example data, I think the implications are huge, and it's going to take a couple years to even fully understand all the things that you can do. But I think if you're reaching out to other communities, spec is a great way to start. So if you go to a JavaScript meetup or a Java meetup, talk about spec, talk about the things that you can do, and I'm sure you will blow some minds. Finally, I just want to wrap it up by saying, the ClojureScript site exists. I haven't had that much time to talk about it in talks other than to say that it exists. Again, a huge shout out to Alex Miller. But this actually needs a lot of work. So maybe you're getting into ClojureScript and you're like, well, I want to contribute, and the compiler seems scary, even though David Nolen says it's easy. Maybe you're not convinced. It still sounds scary. But a good place to contribute that's really easy is the website. There are many links that aren't fleshed out. There are many places where things can be touched up. There are many places where we just need better CSS. There's tons of contribution work, and I think the ClojureScript site is our sort of our first impression for many, many people who don't know anything at all about ClojureScript. And I think we could easily make this an amazing portal for people who just want to get started very quickly. So if you're looking to contribute something, I think ClojureScript.org is a huge, huge place to start. I'm probably in the coming months become much more active there. And Alex is already pretty active, but I'm definitely going to become more active in keeping this up to date. Eventually, we're going to sort of deprecate the wiki and make this the single source of truth. So if you're looking for something to do to help out with the website. And so I just want to end my talk. I hopefully didn't run too far over. It's that, I've been doing Clojure now as both hobby and for work since 2008, so that's, 8 years, and I still love it. ClojureScript definitely and Clojure bring a lot of joy. This is a great book. If you've never read this book, I highly recommend it. It's Fogus and Chris Hauser. There's something really fundamentally awesome about Clojure and Clojure's philosophy of software. And I think as a community, we should think a bit more about how can we sort of, make the tent bigger. So hopefully I've given you some inspiration for that today, and I think I'm done. Thank you.